Welcome to Baseball and Coffee, episode 52 with Tino and Aaron. What's up, Aaron? What's going on?
As you said, it's early morning. Here we are.
That it is. So this kicks off our, I guess, second annual catcher rankings. The way we do this is we both give our top 16 or so for redraft and for dynasty. We'll chat a little bit about it, talk about what we're looking for from the catcher position. These are preliminary rankings. Obviously, they can change. We can revisit them right before the season starts, but I think we can get a pretty good rough idea as to what our tiers look like and what catchers we're valuing. Before that, you got any coffee stories for us?
I really don't. I've just been burning through all the holiday coffee and it's actually getting kind of sparse for the first time in a while. Um, Set up a second coffee this morning. It's actually instant. So like, wow, this is setting a low bar today.
Mm-hmm.
But haven't. I'll make it on our first break to get me through.
Nice.
Yeah, it's nothing too exciting to report. We went out for a couple of local shops a couple of times in recent weeks, but I've just got just a really nice cups of brewed coffee each time. But I don't even remember what they were. I just remember they were good.
Nice. So I stepped out a little bit and this week bought this is a bag of Ethiopia organic Sabel, which is a Sidamo coffee from the Walla Walla Roastery. City roast. Says it has notes of kiwi, vanilla, and chamomile. Very soft, especially coming off of drinking, a blend of different regions typically, which is a little bit bigger cup of coffee. This was definitely harks back to my time in coffee in terms of drinking really kind of beautiful, soft, citrusy Ethiopian coffee. But this has a little bit less citrus, which I really like a lot. It's a little more rounded out. But it's been really fun to have something a little bit different. The minute I saw it as a selection for me to buy, I jumped on it just because I haven't had, I used to love Ethiopian coffee. It was something that I really valued and looked for. And over time, I think I've said this before, I'd start to gravitate towards more Central Americans, but this was a really fun experience for me to be able to find this organic Ethiopian. And then I also have, for years, I drank mate instead of coffee, or I guess along with coffee, but less coffee. And I've gotten back into drinking mate again, which has been quite enjoyable for me. It was something that I consumed a ton of for probably about
And
15
what is
years.
that?
So mate is consumed most notably in South America. And it's funny, of course, in my 20s, I read a ton of books about Che Guevara, who helped to lead the communist revolution in Cuba, and
Okay.
along with Fidel Castro. And Che drank mate all the time, and so it was something that I didn't necessarily believe in everything that Che believed in, but I wanted to experience the mate because it was something that was so near and dear to him. Argentina is where mate is consumed, I believe, per capita more than any other country in the world. But
Hmm.
something that I really enjoyed, highly caffeinated, kind of a coffee substitute at times for me. But I've delved back into that, which has been quite pleasurable. But it's fun to have mate back in my life, to be able to have an organic Ethiopia. Um, I haven't seen a pea berry in a long time, and that was kind of fun too. So yeah, some fun stuff over the last week or so for me. All right, man, let's do this. Catchers. I guess I have a question for you if I can before we get started.
Sure.
Um, the first question that I have, because there's catchers of different, it's like going to the grocery store, right? And there's, 12 different kinds of, I don't know what's a good example, 12 different kinds of lettuce, right? And there are
Yeah.
different lettuces that you can choose from. Some people like butter lettuce, some people like red, some people like green, some people like iceberg. I like all of them, and they all serve a really great purpose, besides maybe iceberg. But
I was gonna say
uh,
I'm out on iceberg.
right, I'm actually in on iceberg, but it's not for the nutritional value. But I bring this up because I think with catcher, there are various ways to acquire certain categories, and there are very few catchers that will provide you value across all categories. So my question to you is, if you can't get Real Muto, and I guess some people might argue Dalton Varsho this year in redraft, what are you looking for from your catcher?
Well, I think for a catcher one, I want someone who is going to contribute somewhere. As you said, there's just not enough supply of guys who are going to help you in multiple categories, counting through ratios, through power or speed. And so I think to me, getting someone who is an asset somewhere
Mm-hmm.
and that you can kind of not build your team around, but no, okay, this is what I'm getting from this particular player,
Sure.
and he's not actively hurting me anywhere else. If you can like at least hit with a respectable batting average if he's a power first guy or something, something to that nature. You're not
Right.
giving too much back to get some small gain in another category. So some degree of balance with some categorical impact in some area.
Mm-hmm. And then, so two other questions come to mind. One is, how much do you value finding that next contributor across categories at this position? Because I think, at least for me, there's probably much more value in finding that balanced catcher than there is even finding one that contributes at an elite level at one category. And then the other thought is, or I guess we can get into this, but I don't see a ton of catchers that provide a really high ceiling. I think a lot of them you can predict a decently high floor, especially with regards to power. But I definitely want to use this exercise to pinpoint, are there any catchers here that you see actually being stars on your fantasy team, right? Because I think people are pegging some of the new catchers that are coming up within the next 2 years or so as potential stars, and I don't know if I see it quite the same way as they do. Um,
How much of that is just narrative because the position has lacked that, and how much of that is actually because of the player?
right. And I think people have tabbed this current crop of young catchers as kind of the best class of catchers that we've ever seen as young catchers coming up. But all of them have certain, I guess, warts in their profile that I could see half or even more than half of them flaming out and not nearly reaching their potential. So I think that'll be an important part of the conversation as we talk about catchers. For me, I kind of agree with you. I think that you're almost looking for a catcher not to hurt you as much as you are to have categorical impact. And then, so for me, I want a catcher who's not going to have any real holes, so to speak. I know that I'm probably not going to get a lot of speed from my catcher. And then I'm also looking for a catcher that does have some upside to really provide, potentially like say 25 home runs instead of 20, or hit 280 instead of 240, or provide even an 800 OPS at catcher would be such a huge deal, right? We had one, two, three, four, five real catchers with real at bats last year get or have above an 800 OPS last year, and I think that's of tremendous value as well, since OPS is a category in many leagues. All right, so let's get started. What's Who's your number one catcher in redraft this year?
It's JT Realmuto.
Okay. Well, so I have Rutschman at one. Let's talk about kind of the pluses and minuses of both of those guys. What is it about Real Muto that makes him number one for you?
I think first, he's just a well-rounded athlete. I think that's something I've underestimated in evaluating him in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And he is, in the top 95% in terms of arm strength and He's by far the best if you look at like pop time. And his sprint speed, I mean, he's in the 85th percentile, and his home plate to first, he's in the top third of the league. So his ability to run, his ability behind the plate, allows him to maximize his plate appearances, and his, he's within a team context that even if some of that takes away from a little bit of bat speed throughout the season as he wears down, he's on a team that, in a lineup that is going to be conducive to him accumulating, counting stats as well. So I just, he doesn't have the elite power. He doesn't have like elite bat to ball or elite like advanced metrics in terms of whiff rate or barrel rate and those things that we tend to oogle over. But I just, again, I just think he's 31 years old. I don't think the fallout's coming just yet. And I'm underestimating how good of an all-around player and athlete he is.
Mm-hmm. So as I said, he's my number 2. I don't debate. I think right now it's more about preference than anything. I do worry, he's got a league average swinging strike rate, which I expect to kind of remain there. The thing that worries me is his zone contact rate is historically slightly below average. And I know that he's done that and produced really great years already, but that's something that I think can potentially decline as he gets older. He also chases at a 35% rate last year. I don't know. My inclination is always to go with the higher walk rate, kind of what I see as higher upside guy. And I think that this is more of a gamble on Rutschman than it is an indictment of Real Muto as number 1. But I see, Rutschman, I don't know that Rutschman even really had a great idea as to what he was doing when he came up, right? He's trying to handle a pitching staff. He's catching most days. He didn't DH a ton. And he came up and walked at almost a 14% rate and still hit 13 home runs. So in 470 plate appearances, he had 70 runs, 13 home runs, 4 steals, and an 806 OPS, right? So I see everything with Rutschman to produce somewhere between a 270 and 290 average and close to a 400 on base percentage. I think the eye has proven to be something that in the minor leagues, it's just a part of his game. And he's got the correct launch angle. He's got the ability to hit his hard hit rate was exactly league average for a catcher. But I think that will increase over time. So to me, the other thing about Rutschman is people say he's young, he has to adjust, but he's actually almost 25 years old. And so I think the development that you would see in the first couple of years in the major leagues, he did in the minors. And I don't think that was a negative for him, especially at the catcher position. I expect potentially, I think I've said this a million times, a 290, 380, 500 season for Rutschman within the next couple of years. And that would far and away put him as the number 1 catcher. I just see a lot more upside. And I do worry about, you said you see a few more years in Real Muto. I worry about a 31, 32-year-old catcher who's caught a lot of games over the last 7, 8 years, starting to wear down a bit. And so if his knees start to wear down and that speed goes away a bit, I think there's the opportunity for him to be passed. Again, not an indictment of him at all. I just think that Rutschman is going to ascend past him. And I really believe in Rutschman's skill set. I think he's a 60 hit, 60 power catcher already. And I do think that if he straightens out some of the knock on Rutschman was whether he was going to be able to really get to his power as much as people thought. And I do think he has the intelligence and the ability to do that. So Rutschman is my number 1. Real Muto is your number 1. Who's your number 2?
Will Smith.
Okay. And so why Will Smith? Where is Rutschman for you? Let me ask you that.
6.
Okay. And so give me 1 through 5.
Remuto, Smith, Contreras, Wilson, Contreras. I need to start saying that.
Sure.
Varsho 4 and Perez 5.
Varsho 4, Perez 5.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I'm gonna push you a little bit and ask, why is Rutschman as low as he is for you? What is it about his profile that gives you pause or has him that low?
Um, of the his ISO last year trails all the players above him. He's on the worst offense other than Sal Perez, but he has a lot less demonstrated power than Perez. But he's in a bottom third offense. I know the Orioles had a nice season, and it was fun to see them spring towards 500 baseball, but they didn't do anything, and I see a little regression for that team, um, given that. And I know that he does everything from an advanced standpoint that we want to see in terms of his swing decisions and things like that, and he's actually fast for the position as well. So he's going to be able to leg out some hits, but I just don't see him standing out in any particular area, whether home runs or steals, and on a middling bottom third offense. Um, but he's going to max out playing time, and I think that's why I have him as 6, because you bring those skills and you bring the volume, it's going to raise him up, I think, to being, in the top 6.
Okay. My pushback would be that I think he's going to hit either 1, 2, or 3 in that order. And whether the team is a good offensive team or not, he's still going to score a ton of runs if he's walking at a 14% rate, right? I also think, and this is a philosophical question, I think, but when a player goes 1-1 in the draft, I think that and then continues to produce in the minor leagues, I think that there's something about scouting there for me. I know I recited a bunch of metrics, but for me, Rutschman he's just a really good ball player. And I'm not even thinking defensively. I'm thinking about fantasy. If you're able to walk that much and hit for power, that's to me I think his walk rate alone is a big differentiator from the others. I would argue, so I've got Salvador Perez at 6. I think it's a declining skill set, and he's probably the most volatile catcher of the top 16 for me in terms of potential outcomes. I know that he'll hit home runs, but there's so much swing and miss, and there's so little discipline. He's on the other end of the spectrum for me from Rutschman, and I see a declining skill set there. I don't know. We can agree to disagree, and I think that's what makes the pod for me. But I do think that 6 is pretty darn low. And I think that Rutschman will differentiate himself from all the other catchers by the end of this year. I think we'd probably say exactly the same words about Will Smith as we did last year. He seems to be maybe the most consistent producer at catcher of any of these top guys. Last year in 578 plate appearances, he had 24 home runs, 87 RBIs, and an 807 OPS. I don't see anything in his profile that gives me pause. In fact, I think he may get a little bit better. He may have an even better year coming before the downslope. Interestingly, 7.2% swinging strike rate for Will Smith is pretty phenomenal. Right-handed hitter, right? You don't see that all the time from a catcher with power. Will Smith is a fun player. I do wish I could acquire him in a league. Do you have a tier? Is it 1 through 6 for you in that tier?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So my 4 is Varsho. I'll say right now that in Dynasty, I've got Varsho all the way down at number 10. And that's because I don't think he qualifies I believe he will not qualify at catcher in 2024. I like his game. I think his counting stats obviously were great last year, and almost 600 plate appearances, which I think he accumulated because he played a lot of outfield, 79 runs, 27 homers, 74 RBIs, and 16 steals. He did hit 235 with the 745 OPS. But what do you think his role is in Toronto? Do you think he gets that many plate appearances and produces those kinds of numbers next year?
I think his plate appearances do go down. I don't know that he will play every day against lefties, but I think he's their primary center fielder against right-handed pitching.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at their track record in the last couple of years in terms of their stolen bases and their stolen base attempts, they're a pretty low percentile team. So I question whether he's going to have the opportunity. I don't question his ability to steal bases. I wonder if his given I expect his plate appearances to go down, and also he might not get as many opportunities as stolen bases to come down a little bit. But I still think having a primary, outfielder and to play him in the catching spot is going to get you a volume
Yep.
with his power and his speed that is pretty valuable.
Do you see him staying at catcher? Like, do you think he has catcher eligibility
No,
in 24? So
no.
that's kind of a so that will change, obviously change the dynasty rankings for both of us, I think. The other thing about Varsho is if people are right about the left-handed pull hitter, their average going up because of the shift rule, Varsho could be a huge beneficiary of that. His pull rate last year was 54.5%. So 54.5% pull, 29.5% center, and 16% oppo. His ground ball rate was just above 40%. So I don't know that he hits a ton of ground balls, kind of average number of ground balls, but I do, again, if they're correct and he's playing on turf, you could see the 235 be all of a sudden become 260, and then you may have a star on your hands in Dalton Varsho next year. My number 5 and the end of my tier 1 is predictably MJ Melendez. I admit that there's quite a low floor potentially with him as well. But I believe in his skill set. It's a reason why I roster him. I do think that his batted ball metrics were very good. Average exit velocity, 90.7 miles an hour. Launch angles in line. Barrel rate was 3.5% above the average for catchers. He hit 18 home runs. The other thing I love about Melendez as a 23-year-old is I do think he maintains catcher eligibility for at least the next few years, but also continues to accumulate plate appearances because he's going to play a ton of corner outfield for Kansas City when Salvador Perez catches. I just think there's a lot of upside there between the power, the 12.5% walk rate, and the opportunity that he's going to have. He is at the bottom of my first tier, and I could see him even ascending even more. In my mind, he has the most raw power of anybody in this tier, and that's worth something. Where do you have Melendez on your ranks?
Ninth.
Okay. You don't see the upside, or is it? Do you think he's not going to accumulate as many plate appearances next year?
No, I think he'll play, and I
Mhm.
don't think he's a max volume catcher. But his outfield eligibility, he is a poor defensive catcher.
Mhm.
However, he is the backup when Perez gets a day off. But yeah, I think obviously the outfield eligibility, similar to Varsho, that ups his opportunities and plate appearances a lot.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I like I love his barrel rate and his speed, as you said, and his walk rate is all good, but he does play on a bottom six offense. So that's something I'm personally moving away from my analysis, is really overvaluing walks, because walks don't count for anything. Especially if you're on a poor team, you're relying on poor hitters behind you to knock you in. So
Sure. So
anyway,
I do value walks in the same way as I did before, in that it impacts OPS, and for us in our home league, OPS is a category. And I think that especially this Kansas City offense is, I'd say it's on the ascent, right? I think Bobby Witt Jr. is a top 5 player for me at both third and short. I think Vinny Pasquantino is, he's a stats darling currently, but I would not be surprised to see him turn into a very, very good first baseman and potentially top 5 fantasy first baseman. So if you're surrounding Melendez with Witt and with Pasquantino, and if there are a few other players, say Salvi Perez has a decent year, all of a sudden you're talking about at least 4 hitters that are above average at their position. Um, I don't think they're going to be a great offense next year, but for me, I'll continue to value walks. I guess that's maybe I'll be the last man standing with that. But you've got to get on base in order to make things happen. And if you can hit for power and get on base, to me, that's worth a ton. I also think that with the new rules, I don't know that any of us know exactly how to value walks versus contact and that sort of thing. In theory, contact will mean more because defenses aren't able to shift. But that's, again, yet to be played out. All right, so that's the end of both of our first tiers, correct? So you have a 1 through 6 that includes Salvador Perez. And actually, why don't you speak on Wilson Contreras a little bit? He's my number 8. So he just signed a free agent contract with the St. Louis Cardinals, 30 years old, previously catcher with the Chicago Cubs. What do you like about Contreras?
Yeah. One last note on the Royals, not
Sure.
just as a counter perspective. The 4 teams of the lower projected batting WAR are the Tigers, the Nationals, the Rockies, and the Reds, and then it's the Royals. And as you said, their best hitter to date is on the decline potentially, and Perez. And I get the idea that Witt is a transcendent player, but I mean he's just one guy, so I question if that team is really on the come. Like they've graduated most of their talent, and they still have the 4th worst batting WAR. But we'll see.
I think,
Wilson
go
Wilson
ahead.
Contreras, I have him at 3rd. He's squarely in that max volume, um, area for me. He, Wilson is an emotional player, and this is narrative. I don't like to get drawn into this when doing analysis, but I do worry about him pressing a little bit this year, going to a division rival and wanting to kind of show the Central and show his former team what he's worth.
Mhm.
But all that said, his demonstrated power, his ISO is over 200. He has a track record of barreling the ball, going to a better lineup that should raise his counting stats. So as you said, that there's no player in this pool. We're very few without nits to pick, as it were. But I just think Wilson again has demonstrated power on an improved team, and will have all the plate appearances that he can handle
Mhm.
following Yachty. So they really don't have much behind him,
Right.
on the depth chart.
I think it's Ivan Herrera is probably, unless he gets traded, is probably the backup for Wilson Contreras. I agree. I think I have to make sure that my ranking isn't emotional. I did acquire him in the offseason before last season. And I think part of it was my buy-in into his batted ball metrics, which are historically pretty great. Um, he did run a 14.5% swinging strike rate last year, and but he's very consistent, right? So he had 21 home runs in 17, 10 and 18, but then 24 and 19, 21 and 21 home runs in 2021 and 22 last year. And so I think counting on a low 20s home run count is something that is you can pretty much do with him, and hitting the ball hard. The thing that gives me pause with Wilson Contreras now at 30 is his batting average has been consistently lower than it was when he first started with the Cubs, right? When he first came up. So over the last 3 years, his batting average is 243, 237, 243. And while batting average can be volatile, as we know, based on luck and some other things, I do think when you start to display a low 240s average over the course of 3 years, you can start to assume that that's kind of the range where it's going to land. Um, for me, because he does continue to run close to double digit walk percentages, that's not something that I'm going to completely shy away from because of the power. But I do think he's a player that is whose skills are on the decline, but counting stats, runs, and RBIs are probably going to take a tick up, as you said, being in St. Louis versus Chicago before the decline. So I don't love him anymore than like I did. But if I can't get one of those top tier catchers early in a redraft, I'm going to hopefully be able to wait, and then Contreras will be really near that next group of catchers for me. But for me, he's at 8. I have Alejandro Kirk at 7, just above Contreras and just below Salvi. 23-year-old catcher for Toronto. 11. So he had 14 home runs in 541 plate appearances. Interestingly, so where does Toronto's offense rank last year? I don't have that in front of me.
I can tell you that they're second in projected batter WAR and second or fourth in projected run scores a game for this year.
Got it.
I don't have last year's stats in front of me.
Okay. So Kirk last year in 541 plate appearances had 14 home runs. He had a 786 OPS, which is obviously at catcher. You're starting to get into a more elite tier. Incredible contact rates. Uh, didn't strike out much at all. So he puts the ball in play on turf, which is great. I wish he was faster than rolling a marble down the or bowling ball down the field. But he had 59 runs, 14 home runs, and 63 RBIs. I do expect those numbers to potentially increase in that offense. Where do you have Kirk?
Same spot as you, sir.
At seven.
Seven.
Okay. And do you
I
think
did
he remains a
go.
catcher?
He's not good behind the plate.
Mm-hmm.
However, with the trade of Marino, he is Jansen's primary backup.
Right.
So I do think he's gonna play that position somewhat.
What about his
I,
profile? Do you like?
the contact ability and the
Mhm.
team context, roster resource has him hitting fourth. Atlanta and Toronto fall into the same boat for me, where they have pitchers who have demonstrated, production in the past and have, different things that they do well, and whether it be power, average. But I'm just questioning, how many plate appearances they're going to see, which is why I moved them in this next tier, because I don't think any of them are max volume types as the guys above them
Right.
are.
Right.
Because Jansen has proven that he is the better defensive catcher, and he brings more demonstrated power. Kirk is, much more uh, batting average, and is fantastic at not chasing and making contact and things of that nature.
Right.
Um, but his power, his launch angle is 8.1 and things, so he's not going to hit for as much power. I just wonder if he's going to get as many DH at bats as he did last year. Given the presence of they signed Brandon Belt for a $9 million contract.
Right.
And I just wonder if he's their primary DH against right-handed pitching, and so if Kirk is the backup catcher and the left-handed or the primary DH against left-handed pitching, what does that look like for his plate appearances?
Sure. I do. So I think before the Belt signing, Kirk for me had the potential to even move into the first tier, right?
Mm-hmm.
And create a top six for me instead of a top five. The Belt signing um, impacts redraft, does not impact obviously dynasty for me. The dynasty question with Kirk would be more about positional eligibility if he can stay at catcher. The other thing is Jansen hasn't always been great. I think Jansen had a very, very good year last year, and there's nothing in his profile that says to me that he won't this year. But Kirk is the more consistent performer, I think, in part because he's a line drive hitter. And I think you can count on him being a high average guy. And you want the power to grow. Whereas I could see Jansen spiking power, but not necessarily maintaining the 260 average that he had last year. With Kirk, I just wish they didn't sign Belt, right? Like if they didn't re-sign Belt, then you're looking at Kevin Biggio getting a lot of the at-bats from the left-handed side. And Kevin Biggio's trash.
Right.
And which would mean that Kirk would almost play every day. That's kind of what happened last year with him.
Well, I
The
think
other
the other
thing
thing
is,
is then they have to keep George Springer upright. So how many days out of the field did they give him as well?
sure,
I think keeping him upright and healthy is a big priority
a
for
huge
them.
key. I agree.
So
I
I
also,
think they're going to leverage that to give him off his feet, because they have enough outfielders on the roster now
right,
that he does not have to play every day in the field.
right. Well, and Vladito is not necessarily the bastion of being in shape and health, right? He's 5'11", 250, and getting him DH time is probably a good idea as well. I think it's a better idea to just put grass down in Toronto than having them play on turf. But interesting makeup. I think it's a big gamble with Kirk, but the fact that he does hit cleanup and did produce the way that he did, he may just play himself into a 600 plate appearance year just because he's kind of better than some of the other guys behind him. I don't know that if he, let's say he takes that next step, right, and is an even better player this year than he was last year. He's only 23 years old. Even the fact that they signed Belt to the contract that they did and traded Moreno, I still could see Kirk just being that player that plays every day for them. But we'll see. It's as much of a guess on my end than anything with Alejandro Kirk as of right now.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that can be I don't dismiss is like his second half last year was not good.
Mm-mm.
And I don't know if there was an underlying injury. I don't know if that was wear and tear of the first full like heavy workload that he had.
It
Or if
could be that
that won't be an,
he's
I just
listed
don't.
at 5'8", 245,
Yeah,
right? And he's
so
catching on turf. And to
I
me,
think
that's enough to say.
we're looking at the the swing decisions and the bat to ball, which I personally can fall for very quickly in that first half last year and kind of dreaming on it. And yeah, and I'm seeing the limitations in terms of potential playing time and the power, and I'm just wondering, or is he being overvalued? But all that said, I have him seventh, so
Yep.
uh, yeah,
I do think the potential's there. But he's a wait and see for me. I don't know that I could invest fully in Alejandro Kirk in the way that some others might. I certainly won't get him in redraft probably because of the way he's valued by others. Let's take a quick break. We'll finish up our tier twos and move on to tier three. All right, let's finish up our tier twos. Why don't you give your entire tier two top to bottom, just to recap?
sure. Before we get rolling on the second part here, I did want to mention meant to mention this at top. Um, the way I'm looking at these rankings is through a 5x5 two catcher format. So my comment about like not counting walks as much, that doesn't take into account OPS. This is batting average only.
Got it. Okay.
So I just wanted to make that clear for anyone listening to listen to it in that context. So my tier two stops at number. I have two guys tied for 10th, so I guess 11. So
Okay.
my tier two after Rutschman was Kirk Murphy, Melendez, Stevenson, and William Contreras.
Mm-hmm. All right. I have so mine is Salvador Perez at 6, Alejandro Kirk at 7, Wilson Contreras 8, Cal Raleigh at 9, Sean Murphy at 10, William Contreras 11, and Travis d'Arnaud at 12. Got to change William Contreras's team to Milwaukee, not Atlanta. It's interesting. So Murphy was on both of our lists, correct? In tier two.
Yes.
I look at him and he had 612 plate appearances last year. And I look at him as he's just a very kind of Joe Schmo average catcher for me. He's exactly what I think of when I think of a decent fantasy catcher. Mid to high double digit home runs, 60, 70 runs and RBIs, very little speed to speak of, 250 hitter, a player that he's exactly what we talked about in the beginning. He's a player that's not going to hurt your team in any place other than steals, but that's a given at catcher. But he's not necessarily going to hurt you either. Do you like a player like Sean Murphy at catcher, just from a taste standpoint? Or are you more willing to take a risk on someone who with a little more upside?
I'd be fine with it because, as you said, he doesn't really, other than batting average, he doesn't necessarily drag you down anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think 2022 was the peak season for him because he maxed out plate appearances. So that sort of solid above average production got that boost of 600 plus plate appearances.
Mm-hmm.
I just still think he's the Braves' primary catcher, and obviously the team context and park context goes through the roof. But they're not going to be nearly as free and motivated to play him as much as the Athletics did. And I wonder how many DH opportunities they get to look at their depth chart. They have Ozuna still on the team who they don't want in the outfield. Although they may have play him in left at some. And then they signed Luplo, I think, as a weak side platoon potential DH, but he
Yeah.
doesn't need to play every day. Obviously, he's a you know a middling player. But yeah, I wonder how many DH at bats to get. And then as you just mentioned TDA. He's not going anywhere either. He's going to get some playing time.
Hmm.
So I think it's kind of a push. I think his skills obviously are good. Playing time is going to go down. Team context goes up.
Right.
Um, Not a great asset anywhere, but a very balanced player and really good defensively,
So what
which
happens
speaks.
to D'Arnaud for you, since he was not in this tier for you, correct?
He was not. No.
I I think my personal opinion. So I did have him at 12 at the bottom of tier two. Um, Part of it is I think he's always been a good hitter. Even when he came up, he was a top 10 prospect for a minute. He's always been a very skilled hitter. Last year in 426 plate appearances, he did have 18 home runs, 61 steals, 60 RBIs. I think he's a very balanced hitter, and he gives you just a tick more hit tool than a lot of the other average catchers, and I like that in a catcher. The other thing is you look at their projected bench as of right now is Travis D'Arnaud, Orlando Arcia, Sam Hilliard, and Jordan Luplo. When I look at that, my assumption is unless they sign someone else, I think D'Arnaud and Murphy will both get a ton of DH appearances, right?
Mm,
I think the plan is for both of them to hit somewhere between 450 and 500 plate appearances each. Maybe I guess conservatively between 400 and 500 plate appearances for both of them. Um, and that to me puts you, if you produce with 400 plate appearances, that does put you squarely in potentially in tier two for catchers. For me, barring another free agent's bat or trading for a bat in Atlanta, I see them both as a part of this tier. Murphy may accumulate a little more, and I think D'Arnaud may have a little bit more quality in his production. But that's an interesting roster, right? Because I think of them as
yeah.
having a bunch of potential stars, and you look at that bench, you're just like, ooh, that's not a very nice bench as of right now. Side note from catchers, I do think counting on Grissom as your starting shortstop is a little bit risky as well. We'll see what happens with them. Who else? So we differed in Cal Raleigh. I assumed we would. Cal Raleigh is a super, at least as of last year, was just a super all or nothing type of hitter. He hit 211, but somehow had a 774 OPS, 27 home runs, tied for the lead in home runs at the catching position with Dalton Varsho. 9% walk rate, almost 30% K rate, 79% zone contact, which does not pretend to a great future. But he hits the ball hard and he hits the ball in the air. I think he looks a lot like Mike Zunino did in the years that Mike Zunino was a decent catcher. He is 25, so he's kind of entering his peak season, in my opinion. Having watched him a ton as a Mariner, I do think he has another season like that in him. And in the right position in the lineup, I think his RBI total could move up from 63. But he is the floor could also fall out with him. So ranking him 9 may have been a little bit generous. I did rank him above Murphy and Contreras, and I think in rethinking, I'd probably drop him below both of those guys. I assume you see the same things in Raleigh and just value that a little bit less, correct?
Yeah. So I have tier three for me is a lot of power forward guys who maybe have some either severe batting average question marks or playing time constrictions. I think with Raleigh, if I was confident he was going to play more, I think he was their primary catcher, but they showed last year they're not going to, give him the full volume that we see in the upper tiers. But I think the power, demonstrated power over the play appearance he does have puts him at the top of that power tier for me.
Right. I'm interested to see what the Mariners do at catcher. Currently in roster resource, they have Tom Murphy as the backup. I don't see the Mariners going into the season with Tom Murphy on the roster. They did trade for Cooper Hummel, and I think the plan is for Hummel to take some of those, some of the catcher at bats at some point. But yeah, I don't know that Raleigh will ever be a 500 plate appearance guy. But even if he's 450 and he can hit the 25 home runs, that is worth something. And I do think that he's got so much power that there is. I'm not going to predict that he is going to ever hit 30 home runs, but I think that he has 30 home run power in that bat for sure. Who else did we differ on? Oh, one more question for you, tier two. Is William Contreras for real?
Well, it's I have him as a $3 player, so he's a positive asset. But yeah, his power is intriguing. His launch angle is 6.1, so the barrel and hard hit rates are eye opening. He has to lift the ball. He is 25 years old, so he's entering his peak season. So we might see some improvement there. He has been a poor defensive catcher. However, Milwaukee has a track record of being able to get their catchers to at least average. They've got a guy like Omar Narvaez, who's kind of an considered a poor catcher. They made him at least an average catcher and passable.
Can I
So
can I ask you can I interrupt real quickly and ask you what is that? How does that impact your evaluation of a catcher? So you brought it up a couple times. How
playing
does that
time,
playing time?
yeah,
Okay.
looking for playing time. I think this is a position where playing time, obviously skills. We all want skilled players, right? But I think playing time at catcher, especially as we get down in this area, is really challenging. So
Mhm.
getting guys who I think William Contreras has a chance to be their primary catcher. If you look at their depth chart, you look at
Mhm.
they obviously targeted him, um, and I think his development arc is potentially really interesting from a power perspective. They can
Mhm.
look the ball a little bit more.
The I guess
He's
the part
interesting.
of the question for me too is there's a cutoff. I agree with you that defense plays a role in at any position in playing time and plate appearances, right? But I do think at catcher there's a cutoff at some point where the catcher's bat isn't good enough to justify DH appearances.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think, but so William Contreras' bat, I do think justifies plate appearances as a DH. Travis d'Arnaud and Sean Murphy, I think the plan is for them to have them DH. But then you start to get into, say, a Jonah Heim or some of the other Gary Sanchez, some of the other bats that are below, and that's where I think the cutoff is, right? Where you're either going to catch or you're not playing because the bat isn't going to be better than the next DH option. And I do think from, when you're playing fantasy, it's important to differentiate where you think that cutoff is going to be. Because
Yeah.
if you think that catcher is not good enough to get DH at bats, you run the risk of having them be a 300, 350 plate appearance catcher, at which point he's probably not draftable unless his rate stats are great, right?
Right.
So to me, there's a lot of value in establishing where you think that line is now that we have a universal DH. Um, I like William Contreras a lot as a player. I do think that, he ran a 344 BABIP last year. Uh, I think in part because he hit the ball on the ground so much. It's hard to figure out whether he's a high BABIP player or if actually he didn't hit the. Oh yeah, he had a 53% ground ball rate. So we all know that your average goes up. You're more likely to have a higher average as a ground ball hitter than you are as a fly ball hitter. That's a given, right? So is the 344 BABIP real because he hits the ball hard on the ground so often? Or was that a touch high? And are we looking more at a 250 hitter instead of a 278 hitter? I don't know the answer to that question. I certainly don't think he's an 860 OPS guy. But he, like Alejandro Kirk, for me, is a wait and see. And I think in redrafts, I probably won't get either of those two because others will value them for the seasons that they just had. But I do think there's a potential for more, and I like his fit on on the Milwaukee Brewers. Uh, he also ran a 10.5% walk rate, which obviously I love. The one scary part about William Contreras and why I don't think he was a top prospect when he came up is the 77.5% zone contact rate last year. So a ton of swing and miss in the zone scares me quite a bit. Anyone else in this tier that we're missing or that we haven't talked about yet?
Um, I mean, we haven't talked about Stevenson, but I think you can rewind to last year's podcast. I don't think there's much that we need to say. We're going to disagree. So,
You mean that I don't love the 409 BABIP
yeah.
or the low exit
Uh,
velocities?
right. No, I
Okay,
mean, he's not a premium power player,
fair
but
enough.
he is a very good, he's in the upper top 10 in terms of defense at catcher, and he has no one blocking his playing time, and he will be a batting average asset. However, his playing time is contingent upon a really tough health track record. He has 3 concussions now, broken clavicle last year, which is kind of a freak thing.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think you can't dismiss that. You can't just assume I'm going to get 525 plate appearances from him because he hasn't he hasn't proven that he can be available.
Right.
However,
You don't love Luke Maley?
it was that exactly. But I do think that outside of Kirk and then maybe Ruiz, that there's very few guys who are potentially a batting average asset, and then you throw in if he is able to stay healthy, what that could mean over the position, over that many plate appearances, the impact it could have on the ratio. Puts him as a pretty valuable player. But I understand there's a lot of question marks, and I also understand he's not a power player.
Right.
I don't
I
expect I don't expect a lot of home runs.
right. Yeah. I don't we can like you said, we can agree to disagree. I think that there is probably a little power potential there just because of the park that he plays in, right? And he's a bigger guy. I just think there are a lot of if we are valuing him as a catcher one, um, I think there's a little bit overvaluing of the luck that he's had in the past couple of years in terms of batting average of balls in play. Um, but I do think that this is a big for you and I as evaluators. It's this is kind of where we draw the line as far as the skill sets that we value, right? And which is to me is very interesting. I see it, even though I'm speaking about myself, I'm trying to see it in a very objective way that um, I do lean OPS and walk rate heavy, right? And that's kind of the type of player that I look for. And whereas for you, there's a contact rate and is probably a bigger deal. And so you put Stevenson and Ruiz, and I think you can kind of put Kirk in that same bucket of player. Moreno is another one that you can put in that bucket where there's a slight question about their power, but they're going to probably provide batting average, and you're waiting for the power to show up. And so you're looking for indicators of launch angle. Is the exit velocity going up? Is the barrel rate going up? To determine whether you think that player has more in their bat than they've showed up till now. You agree with that assessment?
I do, and I think the indicators that you and I look at in terms of potential power. His launch angle is 11.1,
Mm-hmm.
and his ground ball rate's 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So he's putting the ball in a relatively, he's putting the ball in air a decent
Mm-hmm.
amount. And as you said, he makes good swing decisions. He makes a lot of contact, and he's in a park very much conducive to offense. So
Right.
I think those are the indicators, but not elite. But I think yeah, in the back end, if you need volume, especially when you need batting average, is an interesting option.
Mm-hmm. I do. I'd love to. I haven't looked yet. I will when I do a deeper dive. I'd like to see his spray chart as well, because as we've seen, to kind of play on your side a little bit, as we've seen, I cite Marcus Simeon and Alex Bregman all the time, but they're such interesting players to me because their metrics are not great, but they're able to place fly balls down the left field line often. And it's a skill that they figured out, right? They can get out in front of the ball. and they can hit it down the line, and they may not be hitting at 400 feet, but they're still hitting home runs at a pretty prolific rate. And I think Stevenson has some of that potential. He obviously has the bat control. He obviously plays in probably the most hitter friendly park in the major leagues. And so he may pop. I could see him popping a 20 home run season just because he figured out how to place the ball in that way. So I don't put it past him to be able to do that. I do like the back control. Again, just for me, the profile is not one that I typically gravitate towards. But I do think because he's a higher average guy at a position that lacks hit tool, just because by definition, catchers aren't typically great hitters. Stevenson does carry some value. He is my number 18, kind of squarely in the middle of my third tier. Anyone else in tier 2?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So tier 3, let's see here. Looks like I've got Logan O'Hoppe, Gabriel Moreno, Danny Jansen, and Francisco Alvarez. What do you think of O'Hoppe? Where do you have him, and what do you think of him?
Man, I was beating myself up because I never had heard of him before last year.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, man, my prospect game is weak. And then I looked, he was a 23rd round pick. I was like, oh, okay. And that's why I've never heard him.
Right.
So yeah, a bit of a pop up. I mean, obviously had a great season last year. Um, I don't know. I don't know what to make of him. You look at the production, last year, and then he goes to the Angels from the Phillies, where he has potentially wide open playing time. I have him as number 16
Mm-hmm.
because I look at their depth chart. Their catcher is Max Sassy. The Angels are actually eighth in projected run scored a game.
Mm-hmm.
So top third. So yeah, playing time, good context. We'll see. I mean, I wouldn't want to rely on him even though I have him as my 16th catcher. I probably shouldn't
Sure.
because in a well, I guess I'm thinking 15 team league, so that puts him at catcher two.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want to rely on him as my catcher one just because the lack of pedigree, and he just had that really fantastic year last year. I'm not 100% confident it's going to translate. However, I do obviously like the skills that he showed, and I like his playing time potentially. So I said a lot, and I don't think I said anything definitively there.
So I obviously I value him a little more. I do think that he is um that they see him as their catcher one. I think they're going to give him 450 plate appearances next year. To me, he has that same, he's got the same potential to be a d'Arnaud, a Sean Murphy, even a Wilson Contreras, right? He has that in his bat. He did in 21, he hit 270, 331, 789 with 17 home runs across 3 levels. So he's done it for 2 years now. And I think that's he did show up on prospect list going into 22. I don't love, we talked about this a bunch. I don't love the Angels player development system, but I think he's an already developed player. I would think about him more as someone coming out of the Philly system. So O'Hoppe is, he's getting the plate appearances. That they're going to give him a long leash in part because I believe he was traded in the Brandon Marsh trade straight up as a
Yeah.
challenge trade. So there's something in the Angels kind of ego that's going to motivate them to support O'Hoppe and give him as much opportunity as possible. You always wonder when a team trades a top prospect, why are you trading him? Why did the Phillies feel like they could get rid of him? But I like him a lot. I like the opportunity. He's never struck out more than 76 times in a year. So he had 76 strikeouts and 393 plate appearances in 21 and 74 strikeouts with 70 walks last year in AA. So there's not a ton of swing and miss in his profile as well. And I think if you combine the lack of swing and miss with plate appearance, with the opportunity and the power, I do think there's potential for him to be a tier 2 catcher, but I have him kind of at the top of my tier 3. Uh, so a super interesting player to me. Gabriel Moreno was traded from the Toronto Blue Jays as I'd say a consensus top 10 prospect in the Dalton Varsho trade. Where do you value Moreno and where do you have him in your ranks?
I have him just in my sort of interesting mentions outside my top 16.
Uh-huh. What is how do you what do you think he does this year? What do you think his role might be?
It's interesting with Carson Kelly there, who was their primary catcher there last year, who doesn't offer much with the bat.
Mhm.
Um, he popped. He surprised me, and I looked at um, defensive metrics for catchers that Marino looked actually showed quite well because I thought of him as a bat first catcher.
Mhm.
Um, so with the potential that he has, in terms of a hitter, if he can be an adequate or plus defender as well, that's why I moved him up the list. Otherwise, I would have kept him down as just a spec because of Kelly's presence.
Mhm.
Um, I don't have a great feel for how they're going to use him, but that would give me some hope that he's a good enough defender to press Kelly because I think he's clearly going to be a better hitter
Mhm.
than Carson Kelly. If not now, then very soon.
Yeah, I don't. So this is where I think there are points in time for me where I just trust. I said it with Retchman as well. I just trust scouts, right? And so he's a player who hasn't shown much power at all, but tremendous hit tool, right? He's got some people have him as high as a 7 hit tool as a catcher, and so when you have that kind of talent and you give up a player like Dalton Varsho to acquire him, I know Lourdes Gurriel was a part of that trade. I don't think Arizona cares one way or another whether Lourdes Gurriel is a part of that team or not. Um, the trade was really Varsho for Moreno, and scouts value him as a top 10 prospect. A part of it is the balance with his catching ability, but the reality is you don't put him there unless his bat is phenomenal. And so I don't think a 29-year-old Carson Kelly is going to block Moreno at all, including this year. I think they see him as developing with Alec Thomas, developing with Corbin Carroll, being a part of that core for a long, long time. Jordan Lawler. Um, his bat is also good enough to be in the lineup every day, regardless of whether he's a catcher or a DH. Toronto had even talked about giving him reps at third base at one point in time because of the quality of his bat. So to me, I think he gets 500 plate appearances this year. I have him at 14, and if I can acquire him in our home league, I will. And I do think that there's potential to see him at the top of tier 2 by the end of 2023 in redraft leagues. I think he's that good. He's got that kind of talent. Anything else to add on Moreno?
No, I mean it's interesting. I have him down for a 112 ISO. I mean it's in Austin Nola territory.
Mhm.
But as you said, his development arc is still on the way up. So it'd be interesting to see, would he be valued that much by his own team or fantasy wise if the power doesn't come along pretty quickly. Um,
I think he's a
yeah,
player whose bat to ball is so good um, that everyone believes that power will come, and he's also his hit tool is so good that it's the difference between saying, okay, this guy's a 280 hitter, so I think he's going to provide value even though he doesn't provide a ton of power, and someone who has the potential to be a 310 hitter, right? When you're talking about 310, 315, now you're talking about elite hit tool. And so even if he does provide 12 home runs, but he hits 300, they're going to have him hit third. They might have him hit fifth, which is going to start to provide our run and RBI opportunities as well. And I think he's got that type of elite potential. And that's what differentiates him from some of the others with similar profiles, both for me and I think for Major League Scouts as well, which is why he's been a top 10 prospect. And that's not just overall, that's also within Dynasty. He's been talked about in those at that level. Who else do you have in this tier? I've got two other catchers in this tier to discuss.
Yeah, so this is sort of the power tier for me. I had Raleigh, Zunino, Jansen, and Shea Langoliers.
Mm-hmm. We agree on. Looks like we agree on Jansen. I have him at 15. So you think he repeats what he did last year, Danny Jansen?
Maybe not a straight repeat, but I think there's enough growth there where even if he regresses back, he's a he's a plus bat. He's a really good defender. So
Mm-hmm.
I think he's their primary catcher. His whiff rate, his O swing, both were really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make a ton of weak contact. His ISO is over 200. Again, even if you regress that back to like 190, 195, that puts him in the top 10 at the position.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I have him 14th. So I think, yeah, he's a nice option at a less than full-time capacity, but I like the power and I like the plate skills that he showed. And I think, yeah, he'll regress back, but I don't question that the growth was real, even though I think that was a really, won't pop the exact same season again. I don't expect a repeat.
Right. I agree. He's got, he had a above 10% walk rate, sub 18% K rate, which is 5% better than your catcher average. He didn't chase. He had above average zone contact. There's a lot of stuff there to really love. The one thing that makes me a little nervous is his launch angle was 22.2 degrees. That's like Austin Meadows territory.
Yeah.
And so you could see the bottom fall out of his average if he continues to hit the ball in the air as much as he did last year. I don't know if that's a product of hitting the ball straight up in the air or a lot, or if that's just kind of how he. Obviously, they come to that number as a sum of all of the at bats, so you don't really know how they arrive at it. His 50.6% fly ball rate last year, which is pretty high. Of course, he could hit 30 home runs as well. He was my number 15. I think he is a lock, is provided health. He's a lock for high teens home runs, which is obviously of value. Who was the other one you said? Langoliers.
Zunino and Langoliers. Yep.
So you think Zunino will play a lot in Cleveland?
I do.
Okay. Talk about that a little bit. Is
I mean,
Zunino and Bo Naylor?
I know that Bo Naylor is the flavor of the month, and I understand why. I don't think they're motivated to start him with the club. And they have I don't know. The Guardians played Austin Hedges every day last year and
Yep.
accepted a 0. Zunino, we know what he can't do, but we also know he's a really good defender and he has power.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's their primary catcher, and he brings that 215 ISO and the barrel rate and all that stuff, I know that the batting average is going to be horrendous.
Sure.
But I think if you're trying to pair him, if you could pair him as a catcher too with a good batting average, you're going to get volume. And the Guardians lineup, I think, is improving. They're in the top third in terms of projected batting WAR and runs scored,
Mm-hmm.
in the bottom of the first third, I should say. So I don't, the playing the strikeout rate and the swing and miss make me want to cover my eyes, but I do think that that's a team that values defense, that values run prevention. And yes, I think Bo Naylor is really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced that the Guardians are going to make him their everyday catcher the way that we all want them to in fantasy.
Mm-hmm. I'm on the fence. Not with Zunino because I've been burned by him too many times. I loved him actually. Anecdotally, I drove from Seattle to Everett when he first played in Everett, when he was drafted third overall by the Mariners out of Florida. I drove with a buddy just to go watch him play. And of course, that was like the one time in his life that he shot a single to right field. And I thought he was going to be a great hitter. But I don't know. I'm like 50-50 whether Zunino gets the bulk of the time and so the question with Hedges is, did they do that with Hedges because they believed that they could take the zero at catcher offensively to have the elite defensive catcher, or did they do it because they didn't have a better option, right? And I think that's hard to determine year to year why they did what they did. I tend to agree with you, and I think that they believe that pitching is so important to the organization that they want the great defensive catcher. I tend to agree with you, but I think it's worth asking the question, what was their motive?
Yeah. I
But
think track record plays in. I mean, look at this. It's not just last year. I mean, Roberto Perez before that. I mean,
sure.
that it's just something and I read a pretty great article by Zach Mizell on Athletic, just kind of documenting the Guardians catching. It's
Mm-hmm.
been a really long time since they had a good offensive catcher. They just have favored defense, and I think they know what they have, and in the in Bo Naylor. But I
Sure.
think they've openly talked about him being a mentor, like kind of, giving the job to Zanino and him
Mm-hmm.
sort of being a mentor over the next season plus two, and until he's ready to take over, and he might be that one to change
Right.
that organizational approach. We'll see.
I so the other side, real quickly with Naylor, I wouldn't call him flavor of the month. I think for me at least, he's a player that I really liked for a bit. Part of it is that he's almost the lock for double-digit home runs and steals at that position, and so you're talking about at probably his floor being a poor man's, could be a poor man's Varsho or a poor man's Real Muto in some ways. If the hit tool is the question with him, I think coming up. But I think his brother has also proven that Josh Naylor, I think that they can hit both of them. One other thing with Bo Naylor is he was the first round pick in 2018, and I do think that matters to teams, right? That matters to organizations when you have that kind of pedigree. So Zanino is more than a placeholder for Bo Naylor, but if Bo Naylor comes up and hits for real, I think you could see that transition happen sooner rather than later. I'm super high on Naylor. I think that I have him a bit higher than some other of the young catchers, in part because of the balance that I think he can provide. And because if a high on base player on a team like Cleveland that prioritizes putting the ball in play, I think you have the potential to score a ton of runs in that offense if you can just get on base, right? We saw that last year a bit with them. So I do not have Zanino up there. I wish I did, in that I love him. I've always loved Mike Zanino. I've always rooted for him. I've just been burned too many times by him missing the ball by a foot, whether it's outside or high. I have Francisco Alvarez at 16 in redraft. New York Mets top prospect. I don't like him. As a fantasy player, I'll just say that outright. I've never seen a player look like he was running slower than Francisco Alvarez was. I think my 9-year-old daughter can run faster than him, and I don't think his body holds up at catcher. I think he's too. There's such a thing at catcher. I think he's too thick. He's very unathletic to me. So he's got a ton of power in his bat. But I don't agree with the prospect analysis of Francisco Alvarez. I know that sounds a little bit rudimentary in the way I explained it. I've done deep dives on him, but he's not my cup of tea. But I have him at 16 because I think the Mets are going to do what they can to try to prop him up and see what they have, because he is considered to have such an elite ceiling. Any comments on Alvarez? I know he's out of your 16 for redraft, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. A couple of things. One on my comment about Bone Naylor being the flavor of the month is in no way meant to denigrate the his pedigree or
Yeah, yeah,
ability
yeah,
as a player. I
for
meant
sure.
that more as the amount of coverage that he's getting.
Agreed.
I think his talent is legitimate, and I have a lot of faith in the Guardians.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of uh, Alvarez, I don't have a lot to add. I don't have him anywhere on this list. I don't even know if he's really a catcher.
Hmm.
Um, I have to see the Mets actually put him on the field as a catcher before I even believe that he's should be considered a catcher.
Sure.
Um, so
I think that's fair. I don't, again, he's a weird one for me in that, I guess I made a comment about trusting the scouts previously, and I probably should with him as well because he's so highly regarded, but I'm not quite sure what they have in him as of yet. Why don't we take a quick break? We can recap. I know we talked a little bit about reworking this list for Dynasty. I think that could take just a couple minutes to kind of talk about how it changes from a Dynasty perspective. We'll be right back. So my Dynasty ranks are a little, obviously slightly different from redraft. I think that, it's worth saying, at least for the first positional rankings, that within Dynasty, you're projecting out at least a few years, and you're trying to understand who's providing the most value over the course of the next few years or the next 5 years, say. I don't go past 5 years really if I can, because you really never know. At that point, you might trade a player might flame out. You're lucky if you can predict that kind of value, and we all value players of age a little bit differently than the next manager does. But that said, my top four are Rutschman, Real Muto, Will Smith, and then MJ Melendez is four. The reason Melendez is four, not Varsho, I've got Varsho all the way down at 10 because I don't believe that Varsho will qualify as a catcher ever again. And if that's the case in a dynasty, so you'd ask the question, why am I still valuing him as a catcher in dynasty? It's because you're still getting next year. And if I value him as the fourth redraft catcher for me, there's still value in drafting him in a dynasty league, despite the fact that he's not going to be a catcher after this year. So that first tier for me is Rutschman, Realmuto, Will Smith, MJ Melendez. The next tier is Alejandro Kirk at 5, Wilson Contreras at 6. I have Harry Ford, Mariners catcher, my first real kind of prospect, at 7. Super high OBP, another catcher with some speed. Just had an incredible year last year, takes a ton of walks. It's a little high in that he's just going to be 20, but I believe in his talent. I've got Salvi at 8. Again, I think you're still going to get a couple years of big power from him. William Contreras at 9, and then Varsho again at 10 for the 1 year. And then the last year is essentially a bunch of prospects. I've got Diego Cartaya, who on a lot of lists is kind of becoming everyone's number one catching prospect. Logan O'Hoppe, Sean Murphy. This is where I start to put some of those kind of milquetoast veterans: Cal Raleigh, Bo Naylor, and Francisco Alvarez. Cartaya, bigger power than O'Hoppe. A little bit of the roll of the dice. We still wonder where he's going to play with Will Smith in that organization. And then Bo Naylor's a wait and see for me because I could see elevating him quite a bit if he indeed has that 15-15 potential at catcher. Any comments on those?
I think Henry Ford's an interesting because he is 20 and A ball, and he is such a good athlete and so versatile. He's you know, pretty far away from the majors being an A ball. Like, does he stay there? I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question. But I think the player, he was a first, what was he, fifth overall? I know he was a first round pick, but
No, I think he was 10th or 11th,
okay.
but yeah,
Yeah.
point taken.
Yeah, it's I think he's definitely he needs to be on this list. I wonder if he should be a little bit lower just because he's so far away, and I don't know if
Sure,
he will be catcher just because he's so good. That's to his
sure.
credit. That he could play a lot of places.
That's a big, for
Um,
me, it's a big admission. It's an admission of elevating him, I think, much higher than where most folks have him. just
Yeah.
as a believer in his talent. I
The
do think,
other
go ahead, sorry.
the, the other two questions I have or thoughts I have is where would Indy Rodriguez where was he in your thinking on this? And if at all, obviously he didn't make the list, so I wonder what you thought of him. And then
Mhm.
I think for me, Cartaya, with the 70 grade on his potential BA has a 70 on his power. He's demonstrated double digit walk rates at every level, being double A this year, you know, but also someone who really values defense and athleticism. I think he's been a challenge for me to like really try to decide where I stand on him.
Sure.
Because I think that standout tool, and we look at the list that you and I shared today. Power plays such an important part of it,
Hmm.
um, or it does for so many of these players. That's the one category that a lot of these players can really help you. And so if someone come up and really does have true power and on base, but at the same time is not necessarily a great athlete or a good runner,
Right.
it's a challenge for me to figure out where I land.
It is. So two things with Ford. I do think we're starting to see this progression of how we value the catcher position fantasy wise to players that play part-time at catcher. And we're seeing a lot of teams understand that the wear and tear on a catcher really does take away from their offensive production. And so how do they balance the defensive value of that catcher with what they give offensively, right? And I think we'll start to see two catchers catching quite a bit on a lot of different teams. Um, and I think Ford fits that new model where we'll see him catch. We may see him in center field. We may see him at second base, but his bat is valuable enough that they protect him from catching 130, 140 games the way traditional catchers did. And then how the question might be next offseason, how do we value someone like Ford who does that, or someone like if Varsho were to continue to have catcher eligibility, or if Bo Naylor plays a little bit in the field, or Austin Wells, or some of those others, versus like a Cartaya who's just a catcher, right? But a badass one with tremendous power. But do his knees give out at 350 at bats? And so you get big production from him, but he's hurt all the time. Or you see him decrease in production in August and September because he's tired. I think that it's going to be very interesting to see how the position develops over time and whether teams philosophies do change based on that. I should mention too. So to answer your Andy Rodriguez question, I really like him as a hitter. I think he had tremendous production last year in the minor leagues. I do think he's a better prospect for me than Henry Davis is. Uh, I love his hit tool. I love his walk rate. He's a wait and see. I don't know that he's elite in the way that I see the other young catchers that I've mentioned, but I think he's right on the cusp, and it would not surprise me to see him surpass some of those guys heading into next year. I'd made this list before the dynasty list before the Varsho Moreno trade. I would put Moreno in the top 16. I certainly would have him above Raleigh and Murphy and Alvarez and potentially Ohapi and maybe even Cartaya at this point in time. Given that he's in a different organization that's going to just let him develop and get tons of plate appearances. I like Moreno a lot, and I like him more with that trade. But again, your dynasty ranks are kind of a reflection of what you think of some of the minor league players at that position and how you value or how you evaluate age in terms of how it impacts players' regression. Any other comment on the position as a whole? Is it a position that you enjoy? Does it a position of consternation for you? What say you about catcher in wrapping this up?
I enjoy it. I have one of my peers in our home league pointed out to me, he's like, "You have four catchers on your roster." I was like, "Shit, I do." Uh, yeah, apparently I'm accumulating catchers. No, but I do embrace the position. I think you mentioned about the way that teams may be looking at it differently. I think it's interesting as well. We went from thinking we were going to automated balls and strikes and framing maybe going away to now it looks like there's more steam behind a challenge system,
Mm-hmm.
and not being completely automated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something to be thinking about. And I think with the evolution of the base paths and the sizes of the bases as well as the pickoff rules, I'm starting to look at arm strength. As I think that's something teams are going to be looking at. Do we have someone behind plate as a legitimate threat to
Mm-hmm.
keep the running game in check if that becomes more in play? So, with the rules adjustments, I think catcher is right in the middle of that. And I think it's really interesting to look at, what kind of athletes and what kind of arm strength and pop time. I think it's something really different to look at as a fantasy player because I do think it has an impact. As you said, in playing time, whether it's being split more or someone like Artaya is going to be an everyday catcher, what does that foretell for his fantasy value? I
Mm-hmm.
think it's fascinating. And I'm excited to see these adjustments and rule changes in effect this year and have more information to inform this next crop of young catchers.
Mm-hmm. It's for me, it's a scary position. I've spent a lot of years trying to find a dancing partner for Omar Narvaez and patch up the catching position and try to get just enough production to keep me in contention. And that's not been fun. I owned Buster Posey for a couple of years, and it was really nice to have a set it and forget it type of catcher. But I do think there's a lot of volatility because of the wear and tear that catchers have on their bodies. And it's much harder to predict who's going to be the next good hitting catcher than it is some of the other positions. And so I think there's a lot of skill also with roster construction. In a one catcher league, are you carrying one or two catchers, right? Do you want to mix and match so that you can get 500 plate appearances from that position, or is it not worth the roster spot to you? So I just think there's a lot of it's probably the most dynamic position in fantasy, maybe outside of starting pitching, right? Because starting pitching is changing with usage. But yeah, fascinating position to me, super fun in that we've got, in my fantasy top 100 fantasy rankings, I have, it looks like 11, my eyes are so bad, excuse me, 10 catchers ranked in the top 100 for me. So a lot of catchers to watch. Super fun position, changing all the time. Anything to add with dynasty catchers, or yeah, dynasty catchers and catchers at large?
I don't think so.
Cool. I appreciate this. Like I said, I think our fantasy rankings are my favorite podcasts of the year. I look forward to them. If we have time, we'll recap towards the beginning of the season just to, as we get more information from spring training and as players get hurt and get promoted and whatnot, we can rearrange our rankings. But this was fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, Tino.
Thank you, brother.
Be well.
We'll
See you
talk
next
soon.
time.